The first thing I noticed when I walked into Mr. Fenwick's office that Thursday morning was how ordinary it smelled: burnt coffee and something faintly chemical, like carpet that had been cleaned too many times and never quite recovered. I remember thinking that the room felt too small for what was about to happen inside it. My parents were already seated when I arrived. My mother had arranged her hands in her lap with a precision that looked like control but wasn't. My father had brought his own attorney, which I registered as odd in the way you register something odd when you don't yet understand what it means. My sister Priya was there too, still wearing the slight hollow look of someone who hadn't slept enough since medical school, and had simply stopped noticing. We sat in a row of stiff chairs, and Mr. Fenwick began to speak. I was 28 years old, and I was about to find out that my entire past had been built on a false floor. Growing up, I was the second daughter in a household where the hierarchy was never announced but never needed to be. Priya was the obvious one. She was quick and certain in ways I wasn't, the kind of child who answered questions before they were finished being asked, who decided at age 10 that she was going to become a cardiologist, and then methodically made that happen. My parents lit up around her. Not cruelly, they weren't cruel people, which is part of what made it so difficult to name, but she occupied more of the room. More attention, more energy, more forward-leaning interest in her accomplishments. When Priya came home with achievements, those achievements were documented, framed, repeated at dinner tables and family gatherings. When I came home with things I was proud of, a painting I'd worked on for weeks, a short story that placed in a regional competition, a science project that earned a mention in the school newsletter, the response was warm but brief. A smile that moved on quickly. The kind of acknowledgement that is technically present but doesn't linger. I understood early that my contributions to the household's sense of itself were decorative at best. Priya was the investment. I was the other one. My grandmother Doris saw it. She was my father's mother, a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and a business failure, and had quietly rebuilt herself more times than anyone in the family ever fully registered. She never confronted my parents directly, at least not in front of me. But she said things to me when we were alone that felt like small anchors. She would hold my face in both hands. She did this often, as if she needed to make sure I was still there. Whatever it feels like in that house, you are not invisible. I was 11 the first time she said it. By the time I was 17, I understood that she hadn't been offering comfort. She had been making a promise. What I did not know, what no one had ever told me, was that my grandmother had established a trust fund in my name on the day I was born. She had funded it herself, privately, from assets she had accumulated before her second marriage, mostly from the sale of a commercial property she had owned outright. Over the following years, she had added to it steadily and quietly. By the time I turned 18, the trust held $840,000, designated exclusively for my education and future security. Not shared. Not conditional. Mine. I never saw a single dollar of it. When I was 18 and wanted to apply to a fine arts conservatory, my parents sat me down and explained that we didn't have the kind of money that required. They were gentle about it. They suggested the state university, something practical, something that would translate into a real livelihood. I believed them. I was 18 and I had no reason not to. I enrolled at the state school, studied communications because it felt like the most neutral version of what I actually wanted to do, worked part-time jobs throughout, and graduated into a modest career that I built piece by piece, always with the faint and inexplicable sense that I was starting from further back than everyone else. I could never locate the source of that feeling. It was like a sound I couldn't identify, always present, never explainable. Meanwhile, Priya attended a private university, then a highly competitive medical school, then a prestigious residency program. My parents funded all of it. I never asked how. I assumed they had financial reserves I didn't have access to, which seemed plausible. Families keep their money private. I had no reason to look more closely. Have you ever had the experience of a fact rearranging everything around it when it arrives? Not a dramatic fact, not a loud one. Just a quiet one, stated in a lawyer's voice, that lands in the room and changes the shape of every single memory you have stored. My grandmother Doris died of a pulmonary embolism when I was 26. She was sharp until 5 days before the end. And in those final weeks, she had been meticulous. She had called her attorney. She had updated documents. She had written a letter in longhand on her personal stationery, sealed it and delivered it to Mr. Fenwick with explicit instructions about when and where it was to be opened. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had been waiting, with the particular patience of someone who had decided that the right moment mattered more than the fastest moment. Mr. Fenwick worked through the standard portions of the estate first: her house, a modest investment account, a collection of personal belongings. My mother had leaned almost imperceptibly forward. Then Mr. Fenwick said there was an additional matter. He explained that my grandmother had established a trust fund at my birth, funded entirely from her personal assets, designated exclusively for me. He stated the original value. He then stated the current value. 0. My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. Not words, just a high compressed noise that she cut off almost immediately, which in some ways was worse. My father went completely still, the way people go still, when they are not surprised but had hoped to be somewhere else when it happened. Priya looked between the adults in the room with the expression of someone who had just realized she was in a scene she hadn't been given the script for. Mr. Fenwick continued. The trust had been accessed beginning when I was 18. The withdrawals had extended over approximately 7 years. The funds had been used, and here he paused to read precisely from the document, for private university tuition, medical school tuition, and associated living costs for Priya Devereux, my sister's full legal name, recorded inside a document tied to my money. My father leaned toward his attorney. There was quiet conversation that I couldn't hear and didn't try to. My mother had stopped moving entirely. Mr. Fenwick said there was one more item. My grandmother had left a letter written by hand with the instruction that it be read aloud in full, to everyone present. He read it. I won't repeat all of it. Parts of it were only for me, things she said about who she saw when she looked at me, things I'm not ready to make public. But I will tell you what she wrote to my parents. She had discovered what they had done when I was 20 years old, during Priya's second year of medical school. She had confronted my father privately. He had not denied it. He had explained it with the particular calm he reserved for decisions he had already made peace with. Lauren needed the foundation more. My future was adaptable. He would correct the imbalance in time. My grandmother wrote that she had believed him. That she had waited, watched. That the correction never came. So she had made it herself. The letter explained that she had restructured her remaining estate specifically to account for what had been taken. Everything she had, the house, the investment account, all personal assets, she left entirely to me. Not divided. Not adjusted. Everything. She had also, the letter noted, prepared a detailed legal record documenting the full history of the trust's withdrawals and had filed it with Mr. Fenwick with the explicit instruction that it be made available to me should I choose to pursue legal remedy. My father's hands came up to cover his face somewhere in the middle of the letter. By the time Mr. Fenwick finished, the room was absolutely silent. Then my father said, in a voice that was nearly inaudible, "She knew. Just resigned. Like a man who had been waiting on a train he'd known was coming." I looked at him sitting like that and I felt something settle inside me. Not the particular heat of anger, which I had expected, but something heavier and more permanent. I thought about every conversation in which I had been advised to be realistic. Every year I had spent building a careful, ordinary life, never understanding why I felt like I was constructing it from scratch. I had been told the ground was simply like that. I hadn't known someone had removed the foundation before I arrived. I have since retained my own attorney. Priya has told me she had no knowledge of where the money came from, and I believe her, that part at least I believe. My parents have offered explanations, followed by apologies, followed by different explanations. I have sat through all of it. I don't know yet what I'll decide. That process is still moving. What I keep returning to is my grandmother's hands on my face. She was already building the case when she told me I wasn't invisible. She was already preparing the document, already restructuring the estate, already setting up the room where the truth would be spoken aloud in front of everyone with no available exit. She was patient for years because she wanted the protection to be permanent, not just symbolic. She wanted to make sure that when she was gone, I would still have something to stand on. I had that. I just didn't know it while she was alive. And there is something in the knowing, even now, even late, that holds. So let me ask you this. If someone had quietly been building a floor beneath you your entire life, one you couldn't see and were never told about, would it change the way you understood every year you spent? Because it changed everything for me. And I'm still working out what that means.